Imagine this. You're in your apartment, your sanctuary, a box in the sky you call home. You hear your neighbors through the thin walls, their music, their arguments, their lives. But what about the things you don't hear? The silence that means you're being watched, judged, and silently threatened. Today, we are sharing 4 true, unsettling stories about the terror that doesn't break down your door, but lives right next to it. The horror of modern apartment living isn't a ghost. It's a neighbor. It's the quiet, creeping paranoia that comes from living in a box, surrounded by other boxes. It's the passive-aggressive note slipped under your door, the security camera that was mysteriously offline the one night you needed it, the doorman who knows a little too much about your schedule. It's the terrifying erosion of your privacy, where the unspoken rules of the community are weaponized, and the thick, heavy condo silence is not a sign of peace, but a sign that you are completely and utterly on your own. But are you just being paranoid, or is the threat real? By exploring these real accounts, from selective noise complaints to anonymous threatening notes, we will uncover the chilling reality of everyday threats. These stories are a disturbing look at the quiet, modern warfare that happens in the hallways and elevators of the places we are supposed to feel the safest. Now, before we check the peephole, make sure you are subscribed to Whispered Fear and have activated the bell. You don't want to be the one the neighbors are talking about in the morning. Our first story is about the quiet, bureaucratic terror of a homeowners association. It's about the unspoken rules, the hidden alliances, and the terrifying realization that the rulebook isn't a tool for justice, but a weapon. It comes from a man named Michael, a sound engineer who learned that in the silent, carpeted hallways of a luxury condominium, the most dangerous threat is not a criminal, but a neighbor with a grudge, and that the only thing more maddening than the noise you can hear is the noise that everyone else has agreed to pretend doesn't exist. At 35, Michael had finally bought his silence. For years, he had lived in a series of noisy, thin-walled apartments, a special kind of hell for a man who made his living as an audio engineer. His job, mixing sound for independent films, required an almost religious devotion to the purity of sound and to the sanctity of silence. His dream wasn't a big house or a fancy car. It was a home that was quiet, a place where he could work, where he could think, where the only sounds were the ones he chose to create. He found it, or so he thought, in a gleaming new condominium tower in the heart of Miami's Brickell neighborhood. The building, called the Skyline on Brickell, was a fortress of glass and steel, a vertical paradise that promised luxury, security, and most importantly, thick, concrete walls. He had drained his savings, taken on a mortgage that was a source of constant low-grade terror, and bought a one-bedroom unit on the 22nd floor. It was his sanctuary in the sky, a quiet, sterile box where he could finally escape the noise of the world. The first month was bliss. The apartment was an oasis of calm. The thick concrete walls were a miracle of soundproofing. He couldn't hear his neighbors to the sides. He couldn't hear the city below. The only sound was the gentle, distant hum of the building's central air, a sound he found almost meditative. This was the famous condo silence he had been promised, a quiet so profound it felt like a luxury item. The upstairs neighbor, the occupant of Unit 23B, shattered that silence in the second month. The first party was on a Saturday night. It started around 10 p.m. A low, rhythmic thumping of a bass beat vibrating through his ceiling. At first, it was just a minor annoyance, but by midnight it was a full-blown nightclub. He could hear the shouting, the laughing, the clinking of glasses, and the constant, percussive thud, thud, thud of the music. He was annoyed, but he was a new resident. He didn't want to make waves. He put on his professional-grade noise-canceling headphones and tried to sleep. The party ended around 4 a.m. The next morning, he ran into the condo board president in the elevator. Her name was Brenda, a perfectly manicured woman in her 60s with a bright, fixed smile and an aura of absolute, unquestionable authority. He introduced himself, and then, politely, mentioned the noise. Brenda had said with a dismissive, tinkling laugh, "Oh, that's just David. He has friends over sometimes. He's an old friend of my son's. They're good boys." The conversation was over. The message was clear. David gets a pass. The parties became a weekly ritual. Every Friday or Saturday night, the floor above him would transform into a private club, the noise a relentless, weekend-long assault on his peace. His sanctuary had become a prison. The quiet he had paid a fortune for was a lie. The first violation notice arrived on a Wednesday. He had had 2 friends over the previous evening. They had watched a movie, they had talked, they had left by 11 p.m. The notice, slipped under his door, was a cold, bureaucratic slap in the face. It was a formal complaint, citing a violation of the building's quiet hours policy. It came with a $200 fine. He was stunned. He went straight to the management office, the notice trembling in his hand. He spoke to Brenda. He was polite, but firm. He explained that his small gathering could not possibly have been a disturbance, especially when compared to the weekly all-night ragers in the apartment above him. Brenda's smile was a mask of polite, condescending sympathy. She said, her voice a soft, southern drawl, "Michael, we have received no other complaints about Mr. Ross in 23B, but we have received several about you." She gestured to a file on her desk. "Perhaps you're not aware of how sound travels in this building. You work with audio, don't you? Perhaps your ears are just more sensitive than the average person's." It was a masterful and deeply infuriating act of gaslighting. His professional expertise was being reframed as a personal weakness. The problem wasn't the noise. The problem was his ability to hear it. This was the beginning of the war. A quiet, passive-aggressive, and utterly insane war. The parties upstairs continued, loud and unapologetic, and the violation notices for him began to pile up. He got a notice for listening to music at an excessive volume when he was playing classical, cello music at a level barely audible in his own living room. He got a notice for slamming his door when the wind from his open balcony door had caught it. He got a notice for running a commercial enterprise from his unit because a client had dropped off a hard drive. Each notice came with a new, escalating fine. He was being systematically and officially harassed. He was an engineer. He believed in data. So, he decided to gather it. He spent $1,000 on a professional, calibrated sound level meter, a Bruel & Kjaer 2250, a tool of undeniable scientific objectivity. For the next 2 weekends, he recorded the noise from the upstairs apartment. The data was damning. The bass frequencies were consistently in violation of the City of Miami's noise ordinance. The decibel levels were, at times, equivalent to a live rock concert. He had proof, cold, hard, and irrefutable numbers. He also started talking to other residents. He learned in a series of hushed, paranoid conversations in the building's gym and parking garage that he was not the first. Young couple who had lived in his apartment before him had been driven out by the same campaign of selective harassment. An elderly man on the 15th floor had been fined into selling his unit after he had complained about a friend of the board, President's constantly barking dog. The condo board, he realized, was not a governing body. It was a club, a clique, and he was not a member. Brenda wasn't just the president, she was the gatekeeper, using the building's rulebook not to maintain order, but to curate her own personal vertical community. The official condo board meeting was his last stand. It was held in the building's soulless community room. He sat at a long, folding table, facing Brenda and the other 4 members of the board, a silent, judgmental jury. He presented his case. With the cool, methodical precision of an engineer, he showed them the decibel readings. He played them the audio recordings of the upstairs parties. The shouting, the thumping bass, the sounds of a weekly, unsanctioned nightclub. And then he presented the stack of violation notices he had received for offenses that were, by any objective measure, 100 times quieter. When he was finished, the room was silent. He had presented a case built on a foundation of irrefutable scientific fact. He had them. Brenda just looked at him, her polite, fixed smile never wavering. She said, her voice a sweet southern poison. "Thank you for your very thorough presentation, Michael. It is clear you have put a lot of effort into this." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "However, it has come to our attention that you have been making unauthorized audio recordings of your neighbors, which is a direct and serious violation of Section 14, Paragraph B of the Condominium bylaws regarding resident privacy." She slid a piece of paper across the table. "Therefore, the board has voted to dismiss your complaint and to issue you a final Level 3 fine of $2,000 for unauthorized surveillance. If this fine is not paid within 30 days, we will begin foreclosure proceedings on your unit." The world seemed to tilt and fall away. His own evidence, his proof, his truth had been expertly and legally turned into a weapon against him. He hadn't just lost. He had been annihilated. He was left with a truth more horrifying than any ghost. The system was not just broken. It was a lie. The rules were not a shield to protect the residents, they were a sword, to be wielded by those in power. He was in his apartment that night packing, his dream home now just a box full of debt and quiet, bureaucratic rage, when he heard a knock on his door. It was a young woman, a resident from a few floors up who had been at the meeting. She looked terrified, she whispered, her eyes darting down the empty hallway. "I'm so sorry, you were right. Everyone knows you were right. We're all too afraid of her to say anything." She leaned in closer, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "It's not just parties, you know. The man upstairs, David, he and Brenda's son, they're not just having friends over. They're running a business. An illegal after-hours bottle club. They charge a cover at the door. They sell liquor without a license. It's a huge cash business. That's why they couldn't let you win. Your complaint wasn't just a complaint. It was a threat to their entire operation." The final, sordid, and deeply human piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This hadn't been about social engineering. It hadn't been about clicks. It had been about money. Simple, dirty, and illegal money. He was left with a quiet, chilling knowledge. The monster in his story was not a ghost or a demon. It was just a group of ordinary, greedy people who had weaponized the quiet, mundane language of bylaws and regulations to create their own private and utterly corrupt kingdom. He sold the apartment at a loss a month later, a refugee from a quiet, polite, and deeply brutal war. He now lives in a small rented house with thin walls, where he can hear his neighbors arguing, their babies crying, their music playing, and he finds to his own surprise that he no longer minds the noise. He has learned that the true, terrifying condo silence is not the absence of sound. It is the silence of good people who are too afraid to speak up. The silence that allows the real monsters to do whatever they want right in the room next door.
No footage available.
Our next story is about the illusion of modern security. It's about the quiet, implicit faith we place in the silent digital eyes that watch over our lives. It comes from a woman named Sarah, who learned that a security camera is not a neutral observer. It has an agenda, and that sometimes the most terrifying crime is not the one that is captured on video, but the one that is deliberately and silently erased. At 29, Sarah's life was a carefully calculated investment in the future. A data analyst for a financial tech firm, she was a woman who understood risk, who believed in verifiable data and secure systems. After years of living with roommates, in chaotic shared houses, she had finally saved enough to buy her own place. It was a small one-bedroom condo in a new, state-of-the-art building in Denver's Lodo neighborhood called the Lofts at Wynkoop. It was a fortress of modernity, a place of key fob access, of a 24-hour concierge, and most importantly, of a comprehensive building-wide security camera system. For a woman who spent her days analyzing risk, the building's promise of total security was its biggest selling point. It wasn't just a home. It was a secure asset, a place where the chaos of the outside world could not reach. Her most prized possession, the one thing that was a tangible symbol of her hard-won independence, was her bicycle. It was a high-end, Specialized Roubaix road bike, a sleek carbon fiber machine that had cost more than her first car. It was her freedom, her escape. Every weekend she would ride for hours, leaving the city behind, climbing the winding roads up into the foothills of the Rockies. Her bike was not just an object, it was a part of her soul. And she kept it, of course, in the building's secure, key fob access-only bike storage room in the underground garage. The room was a small chain-link cage directly under the unblinking red-lit eye of a high-definition security camera. It was, she believed, the safest place in the entire city to store a $5,000 bicycle. The discovery that her fortress was a lie came on a Tuesday morning. She went down to the garage, ready for her pre-work ride, and found her bike missing. It wasn't just gone. The heavy kryptonite U-lock she had used to secure it to the steel rack had been cut. A single clean slice through the hardened steel, likely from a pair of hydraulic bolt cutters. The lock lay on the concrete floor, a broken metal carcass. Her bike, her freedom, was gone. The violation was a physical blow. A wave of nausea and a cold, shaking rage washed over her. But underneath the anger was a single reassuring thought. The camera. The theft had happened in a small, well-lit room, directly under the gaze of a security camera. She had the perpetrator. The crime was a solvable equation. She went straight to the building manager's office in the lobby. The manager, a man in his 60s named Mr. Henderson, was the picture of grandfatherly concern. He listened to her story with a grave, sympathetic expression, tut-tutting at the audacity of the thief. He said, his voice a soothing professional balm. "Don't you worry, Ms. Evans, the thief couldn't have picked a worse spot. That camera record's in 4K. We'll have a crystal clear image of his face for the Denver police. Let me just pull up the footage from last night." Sarah stood by his desk, a sense of grim, righteous satisfaction washing over her. The system was working. Her investment in a secure building was about to pay off. Mr. Henderson typed on his keyboard, his fingers moving with a slow, deliberate pace. He navigated to the security footage archive. He selected the camera for the bike storage room and the timeline for the previous night. He clicked play, and then he frowned. He muttered, more to himself than to her, "That's odd." He clicked the mouse a few more times. His frown deepened. He let out a small, frustrated sigh. "What is it?" Sarah asked, the knot of anxiety in her stomach returning. Mr. Henderson turned to her, his face a mask of polite, bureaucratic apology. "I am so sorry, Ms. Evans," he said. "It appears there was a system glitch. The footage from the bike room camera is unavailable from 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. last night. It seems to be corrupted. The file just won't play." He shook his head. "I can't believe the timing. It must have been a power surge. We've been having some issues with the grid in this area. I'll have our IT vendor, a company called Mile High Security, come out and take a look at it today." The words were all plausible. The tone was perfectly sympathetic. But to Sarah, a woman who spent her entire life analyzing data, the coincidence was too perfect, too neat. A 3-hour targeted data corruption on the one night her bike was stolen. It wasn't just a glitch, it was a statistical impossibility. The police were called. A young, tired-looking officer from the Denver Police Department's District 6 came and took a report. He was professional but not hopeful. He'd said, "Without the footage, ma'am, I'll be honest with you, the chances of recovering a bike like that, they're slim to none." The system had failed. Her fortress had been breached, and its all-seeing eye had conveniently and inexplicably blinked at the exact moment of the crime. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's grief over her stolen bike was slowly replaced by a cold, analytical obsession. She was a data analyst. She had been presented with an anomaly, and she was determined to find the pattern. She started talking to her neighbors, a quiet one-woman investigation conducted in the polite, neutral territory of the building's elevator and laundry room. At first, she found nothing. Most residents loved the building, praised its security, but then she found another victim. A young man on the 5th floor who'd had his car broken into in the secure garage a month prior. The thief had stolen a laptop from his front seat. The car had been parked directly in front of a camera, and the footage from that night, unavailable, corrupted, a system glitch. She kept digging. She found an older woman on the 10th floor who'd had a valuable package stolen from the mailroom, a package that had been delivered directly in front of a security camera. The footage? A brief, inexplicable 2-minute gap, right at the time of the delivery. A pattern was emerging, a pattern of convenient and highly targeted technological failures. But there was another, more sinister, layer to the pattern. She started to notice who the victims weren't. Last week, the son of the condo board president, a notoriously arrogant young man named Chad who drove a loud, obnoxious Maserati, had gotten a small scratch on his car's bumper in the garage. Within an hour, Mr. Henderson had reviewed the security footage, identified the hapless delivery driver who had accidentally done it, and had presented Chad with a crystal-clear 4K video of the entire incident. The system, it seemed, worked perfectly when it was protecting the right people. The victims of the glitches were all like her, newcomers, renters, not owners, people who were not a part of the building's established and very cliquey social hierarchy. The security system was not a shield for everyone. It was a tool, being used with a quiet surgical precision to protect the interests of a select few. The quiet, bureaucratic terror of the situation was far more frightening than a simple theft. This was a conspiracy of silence, a quiet, passive-aggressive war being waged against the building's outsiders. She knew she needed proof, her own proof. She became a quiet, watchful analyst of her own environment. She knew who the likely culprit for her bike theft was. Chad, the board president's son. He was a known troublemaker, a kid who had lived his entire life in a bubble of consequence-free privilege. She had seen him eyeing her bike before. She learned his routine. She knew he often used the back service alley to smoke, to meet his friends, away from the prying eyes of the main entrance cameras. She bought her own camera, a small, discreet Wise Cam powered by a portable battery pack. One night she taped it to the inside of a metal utility box in the service alley, its small black lens perfectly positioned to see the back entrance to the garage. For 2 weeks it captured nothing but the mundane late-night life of the alley, and then she caught him. The footage, time-stamped at 2:37 a.m. on a Wednesday, was grainy, but undeniable. It showed the building manager, Mr. Henderson, the kind, grandfatherly man, walking to the keypad-controlled service door of the bike storage room. He did not use a key fob. He tapped in a master code. He opened the door and held it open. A moment later, Chad, the board president's son, and another young man emerged from the room, carrying a large, heavy-duty pair of hydraulic bolt cutters. Chad gave Mr. Henderson a familiar casual nod, and then they disappeared down the alley. A minute later, the footage showed Mr. Henderson walking over to a small, gray, and completely unmarked utility box on the wall, the local server hub for the garage's security, cameras. He opened it with a key, reached inside, and did something she couldn't quite see. He closed the box and walked away. The footage was a smoking gun, a quiet digital record of a conspiracy. The camera hadn't just blinked. It had been deliberately and expertly blinded. The theft hadn't just been a random crime. It had been an inside job, a crime committed by a privileged resident and actively, silently, covered up by the very man who was in charge of their safety. She was left with a choice that was no choice at all. She could take the footage to the police. She could expose the entire corrupt system, and in doing so, she would make an enemy of the most powerful people in the building. Her home would become a war zone. Her life would become a living hell of quiet, bureaucratic retaliation. Or she could stay silent. She could accept the loss of her bike as the price of admission, the cost of living in a world where security is an illusion, and justice is a commodity available only to the highest bidders. She now lives in a state of quiet, vigilant paranoia. She still lives in the lofts at Wincoop, a prisoner of a mortgage and a collapsing housing market, but she no longer trusts the locks on her door. She no longer trusts the friendly smile of the man in the management office. And she never, ever trusts the little red blinking light of a security camera. She is left with the quiet, chilling knowledge that the condo silence she had bought into was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a conspiracy. The silence of a community that has agreed to look the other way, and she is haunted by a final and deeply unsettling question: how many other crimes, big and small, are being silently and expertly erased from the record every single day by the simple, quiet, and terrifying blinking of a camera that has been politely and deliberately told to look away?
Just a friendly reminder.
Our final story is about the quiet, simmering violence of passive aggression. It's about the slow, methodical, and utterly deniable warfare that can be waged with nothing more than a pen and a piece of paper. It comes from a woman named Megan, a writer who learned that the most terrifying threats are not the ones that are shouted from the rooftops, but the ones that are slipped silently under your door. A quiet, anonymous, and inescapable campaign of psychological terror disguised as neighbor's humor. At 31, Megan's life was a fortress of quiet solitude. She was a freelance medical writer, a job that allowed her to work from the quiet, controlled environment of her own home. After a chaotic and painful divorce, she had moved to a new city, seeking the one thing she craved above all else: anonymity. She found it in Chicago, a city of millions, a place where you could be surrounded by people and be completely, blessedly alone. She rented a one-bedroom apartment in a massive modern high-rise in the River North neighborhood, a sleek glass and steel tower called the Sterling. The building was a vertical city, home to 1,000 other anonymous souls. It was perfect. Her apartment on the 27th floor with its panoramic view of the Chicago River was her sanctuary, a place where she could finally, truly, be left alone. The building, like all such places, was governed by a thick, laminated rule book, a sacred text of bylaws and regulations. No noise after 10 p.m. Cardboard boxes must be flattened. No items to be left in the hallway. It was a world of enforced and deeply comforting order. The first note appeared on a Monday morning. A single, crisp white envelope slipped under her door. The note inside was typed, printed on a cheap piece of copy paper, the font a bland, impersonal Times New Roman. It read, "A friendly reminder that the recycling bins are for flattened cardboard only. Let's all do our part to keep our community clean, thanks." Megan frowned. She had put a single, unflattened Amazon box in the recycling room the day before. She had been in a rush. It was a minor transgression, but the note, it was the epitome of passive aggression, the cheerful, corporate-speak friendly reminder, the exclamation points, the smiley face. It was a polite, but clear, act of accusation. She was annoyed, but she was also a woman who avoided conflict at all costs. She crumpled up the note and made a mental reminder to be more careful. The second note arrived a week later. "Hi, neighbor. Just a heads up, the smell of your cooking, garlic maybe, was quite strong in the hallway last night. Some of us have sensitivities. Thanks so much for understanding." This time the annoyance was tinged with a new, colder feeling, a feeling of being monitored. Someone had not just walked past her door. They had stopped, they had sniffed, they had taken note, and then they had gone back to their own apartment and taken the time to type, print, and deliver a complaint disguised as a polite neighborly request. She reported the notes to the building's management, a large, faceless corporation called the Habitat Company. The response from the building manager, a woman with a perpetually tired voice, was a lesson in corporate indifference. The voice had sighed over the phone. "Ma'am, we can't get involved in anonymous note diplomacy. As long as there are no direct threats, we consider it neighbor's humor. It's just part of high-rise living." The notes became a regular fixture of her life, a quiet, paper-based haunting. They were always typed, always anonymous, and they were always about some tiny, insignificant, and deeply personal observation. Your guest on Tuesday parked in the 15-minute loading zone for 18 minutes. The rules are there for a reason. I noticed you get a lot of packages from Net-a-Porter. Must be nice. Some of us are on a budget. That was a late night for you on Wednesday. Hope you had fun. The walls in this building are thinner than you think. The last one, with its winking emoji and its thinly veiled reference to her private life, was the one that transformed the annoyance into a real, creeping fear. This was no longer about rules. This was about surveillance. Someone or some group of people was not just observing her. They were keeping a log, a detailed, judgmental, and utterly comprehensive log of her entire existence. The fortress of her anonymity had been breached. She was no longer an invisible face in a crowd of 1,000 residents. She was a subject, a specimen under a microscope. Her quiet, solitary life had become a performance for an unseen and increasingly hostile audience. The paranoia was a slow, quiet poison. She started to second-guess every decision. Was her TV too loud? Was she closing her door too forcefully? She started to feel like a guest in her own home, constantly afraid of breaking some unspoken rule, of earning another small, white, and silently screaming piece of paper under her door. The true, insidious horror of the situation was its deniability. It was, as the manager had said, just neighbors' humor. They were just notes. There was no physical threat, no violence, but it was a profound and deeply effective form of psychological warfare. A campaign of gaslighting, designed to make her feel like she was the one who was unreasonable, the one who was overreacting, the one who was crazy. The escalation from passive aggression to a veiled but unmistakable threat came on a Saturday night. She was in her kitchen cooking dinner, and she dropped a heavy cast-iron pan on the floor. The sound was a loud, echoing clang in the quiet building. She winced, a jolt of pure, conditioned fear shooting through her. She knew a note would be coming. The next morning it was there, but this one was different. It was not typed. It was written in a messy, angry, all-caps scrawl. Some people have to work in the morning. A loud noise at night can be very startling. It would be a shame if something were to startle you when you're trying to sleep. She stood in her silent hallway, the note trembling in her hand, the words a cold, hard declaration of war. The line had been crossed. This was no longer a complaint. This was a threat. She knew she had to find out who was doing this. She had to put a face to the ghost that was haunting her. She bought a camera, a tiny motion-activated peephole camera, a discreet device she could install on the inside of her own door. It would record anyone who approached her doorway. For a week, the camera recorded nothing but the mundane, quiet life of the 27th floor hallway. And then, she caught them. She was reviewing the footage from the previous night. At 3:17 a.m., the camera had been triggered. The footage showed the empty, dimly lit hallway. And then a figure emerged from the stairwell. It was a woman. An elderly woman with a kind, grandmotherly face and a head of perfectly coiffed white hair. It was Brenda, the head of the building's welcoming committee, a woman who had greeted Megan with a warm smile and a basket of muffins on the day she moved in. She watched, her blood turning to ice as the kindly-looking woman crept to her door, knelt down with a quiet groan of effort, and slipped a white envelope under the door. Then she just stood up, gave a small, satisfied smile, and walked away. The mystery was solved. But the solution was, in many ways, more terrifying than the mystery itself. The monster was not a shadowy, anonymous figure. It was the smiling, friendly, and utterly benign-looking woman who organized the building's monthly book club. But as she continued to watch the footage, she realized the story was even darker. A minute after Brenda had left, a second figure appeared. A man from the apartment across the hall, a man who always gave her a polite, friendly nod in the elevator. He walked to her door, took a picture of the note with his phone, and then walked away. A few minutes later, another resident, a young woman from down the hall, did the exact same thing. This wasn't one lonely and obsessive person. This was a group, a conspiracy. The welcoming committee was also the intimidation committee, a secret, self-appointed cabal of residents who had taken it upon themselves to police the building's culture, to enforce their own unspoken rules of conduct. She took the footage to the building's management. She had proof. Hard, undeniable video proof of the harassment. She met with the senior property manager, a man with a tired corporate face. She played him the video. He watched it, his expression unreadable. When it was finished, he let out a long, weary sigh. He began, his voice the sound of a man who had had this exact conversation 100 times before. Ms. Albright. Brenda and the other long-term residents, they are the heart of this community. They are protective of the building's atmosphere. Their methods are sometimes unorthodox, but their intentions are good. He looked at her, and his eyes were not the eyes of an ally. They were the eyes of a man who had already made a calculation, and she was not on the winning side of the equation. He continued, the word a quiet, professional insult. They see you as a transient, a young person who works from home, who doesn't participate in the community events. They see you as a temporary resident who does not respect the quiet, established culture of the building. She asked, her voice a whisper of disbelief. So you're not going to do anything? He said, his tone final. There is nothing to be done. They have not broken any laws. They are just communicating. If you find the environment of the community to be incompatible with your lifestyle, you are, of course, free to break your lease. There is, as you know, a substantial financial penalty for doing so. And there it was. The final horrifying truth. The management knew. They had always known. And they allowed it. They encouraged it. The committee was not a rogue group. They were a tool, a deniable, unofficial, and brutally effective tool for pushing out tenants they deemed undesirable, without having to go through the messy legal process of an eviction. She was not in a community. She was in a cult, and she had just been excommunicated. She was left with a choice that was no choice at all. She could stay and live in a state of constant low-grade warfare, a prisoner in her own home, haunted by the quiet, smiling faces of her neighbors. Or she could leave, losing thousands of dollars in a lease she could no longer afford to break and could no longer afford to honor. She now lives in a different building, a smaller, older, and less luxurious place, where the walls are thinner and the neighbors are louder. But she finds, to her own surprise, a strange comfort in the noise. The sound of a baby crying, of a loud argument, of bad music being played too late at night. They are the sounds of life, of a messy, imperfect, and blessedly unpoliced community. She is left with the quiet, chilling knowledge that the true condo silence is not the absence of noise. It is the silence of a community that has agreed to look the other way. The silence that allows the quiet, smiling monsters next door to do whatever they want, and to call it just neighbors' humor.
Who was that you were with last night?
Our final story is about the paradox of urban safety. It's about the silent, implicit bargain we make when we trade our anonymity for a sense of security. It comes from a woman named Jessica, a lawyer who moved into a full-service pre-war apartment building, believing its greatest amenity was its discretion. She learned that the man who held the keys to her fortress was also the one who was quietly, methodically, and lovingly dismantling its walls, one friendly conversation at a time. At 33, Jessica's life was a carefully constructed fortress against the chaos of her past. She was a successful, but deeply private corporate lawyer in New York City. 2 years prior, a messy, traumatic breakup with a man who had refused to accept the end of their relationship had culminated in a terrifying stalking incident. The police had gotten involved. A restraining order was issued, and the man had finally, blessedly, disappeared. But the experience had left a permanent scar on her sense of safety. She lived in a constant, low-grade state of hypervigilance, a soldier still fighting a war that was supposed to be over. Her move to the Chamberlain, a prestigious pre-war co-op on the Upper West Side, was the final and most expensive brick in her new wall of security. The building, a grand, Gothic Revival fortress on Riverside Drive, was a relic of a bygone era. It had thick plaster walls, a quiet marble-floored lobby, and, most importantly, a 24-hour doorman. For Jessica, the doorman was not a luxury. He was a necessity. He was the gatekeeper, the human firewall that stood between her and the unpredictable dangers of the city. Her apartment on the 9th floor, with its stunning protected views of the Hudson River, was more than a home. It was a sanctuary, a place she was paying a small fortune to finally truly feel safe. The gatekeeper of this sanctuary was a man named Arthur. He was a quintessential New York doorman, a man in his late 70s who had worked at the Chamberlain for over 40 years. He was a living piece of the building's history. He had a kind, grandfatherly face, a gentle, lilting Irish brogue, and an almost supernatural ability to remember the name of every resident, every guest, every pet. He was the building's soul. The residents didn't just respect him, they adored him. And for Jessica, his constant, steady, and watchful presence at the front desk was the most comforting thing in the world. For the first year, life at the Chamberlain was a quiet, healing dream. The thick pre-war walls were a perfect sound barrier. The profound, respectful condo silence was a balm to her frayed nerves, and Arthur was her guardian angel. He would greet her every morning with a warm, "Have a good day at the firm, Ms. Day," and every evening with a "Welcome home." He was a constant, reassuring presence. The first hint that his watchful presence might be something more, something different, was subtle. It was a compliment, he'd said one afternoon as she was collecting her mail. "Your sister is a lovely woman, Ms. Day. So good of her to visit you again so soon." Jessica just smiled, a little confused. Her sister had visited last weekend, a surprise trip. And she had visited again unexpectedly yesterday just for lunch. Jessica hadn't mentioned the second visit to anyone. And Arthur hadn't been on duty when her sister arrived or left. How did he know? He must have seen her on the security logs. She reasoned. He's just being observant, he's just being Arthur. A few weeks later, another, more specific, piece of impossible knowledge. She was leaving for a client dinner one evening. Arthur said, holding the door for her, "Enjoy your meal at Per Se, Ms. Day. I hear the truffle tasting menu is simply divine." This time of year. She stopped on the sidewalk, a cold jolt of surprise shooting through her. Per Se was one of the most exclusive and difficult-to-book restaurants in the city, located in the Time Warner Center on Columbus Circle. She had made the reservation under a different name, for her client. She had not told a single soul where she was going. How could he possibly know? He must have overheard her on the phone, she told herself. The lobby has an echo. It was a flimsy explanation, but it was the only one she had. The incidents began to accumulate. The quiet, unsettling drip, drip, drip of a man who knew too much. He knew the name of the junior associate she was mentoring at her firm, Sullivan and Cromwell. He knew about the quiet weekend trip she had taken to the Hamptons. He knew that she had switched from using Fresh Direct to Whole Foods for her grocery delivery. They were all small, insignificant details, but they were her details, her private, unshared, and supposedly unknown details. The fortress of her privacy was being quietly and systematically breached, and the breach was coming from the one person who was supposed to be its guardian. The nature of the horror shifted from a quiet, personal unease to a public, social paranoia. She began to realize that Arthur wasn't just observing her, he was sharing his observations. She would be in the elevator with another resident, an elderly woman from the penthouse, and the woman would say, "Oh, Jessica dear, Arthur tells me you're a big fan of the Philharmonic. So am I. We should go together, sometime." She had mentioned her love of the Philharmonic in a single private phone call to her mother, a call she had made from the supposed privacy of her own living room. Her life was no longer her own. It was a television show, and Arthur was the narrator, providing a running, friendly, and utterly violating commentary to the entire building. The friendly hellos from her neighbors in the hallway no longer felt friendly. They felt informed. Every smile seemed to be backed by a secret, shared knowledge of her life. The quiet, respectful anonymity of the building was gone, replaced by the suffocating, small-town intimacy of a place where everyone knew her business. Her sanctuary had become a fishbowl. The anxiety she had moved here to escape came roaring back, stronger than ever. But this time it was different. Her previous stalker had been an external threat, a monster she could see, a danger she could get a restraining order against. But how do you get a restraining order against a friendly, beloved 78-year-old doorman? How do you report a man for being too observant, too friendly? The very nature of his violation was its deniability. He wasn't threatening her, he was just talking. He was just being Arthur. She was being haunted by a ghost of pure, unfiltered information. The final, terrifying revelation of the true extent of his surveillance came on a Saturday. She had brought a man home for the first time since her breakup. It was a new relationship, a fragile, tentative thing, and she had guarded it with a fierce, protective privacy. They had had a quiet dinner at her apartment, and he had spent the night. The next morning, as they were leaving the building together, Arthur was at the desk. He gave them his usual, warm, grandfatherly smile. "Good morning, Ms. Day," he said, and then he looked at the man beside her. "And it's a pleasure to finally meet you, Mr. Henderson. I do hope you enjoyed the Sauvignon Blanc you brought last night. It's an excellent choice." The man, James, just stared at him, a look of stunned, confused silence on his face. Jessica felt the blood drain from her own. The wine. They had killed the bottle. There was no way Arthur could have seen it. They had not passed through the lobby with it. She had brought it home in a grocery bag 2 days earlier. He had not just seen James arrive. He had somehow been at their dinner table with them. She knew she had to understand the logical explanation that he was a gossip, that he had sources, that he was just a nosy old man and was no longer sufficient. This was something else, a level of surveillance that was almost supernatural. That night, after a long, difficult, and ultimately final conversation with James, who could not handle the quiet, bizarre intensity of her life, she began her own quiet investigation. She was a lawyer. She knew how to look for evidence. She started with the building itself. The Chamberlain was a relic of a different era, an era of servants, of service entrances, of a world that was built with a different understanding of privacy. She went to the New York City Department of Buildings and pulled the original, pre-war blueprints for her building. She spent the entire night on her living room floor, the massive, brittle pages spread out around her, a map of her own, gilded cage, and she found it. It was a detail so small, so archaic, that it had been completely overlooked in the building's modern renovations. The blueprints showed an old, original, building-wide annunciator system, a primitive, pre-electric version of an intercom. Was a network of hidden brass speaking tubes that ran through the walls, connecting every apartment to a central switchboard at the doorman station in the lobby. The system had been designed so that the doorman could listen in, to be of service to the building's wealthy residents. The system had been disconnected and plastered over in the 1950s, or so the official record said. The next morning, she knew what she was looking for. She went to her own living room wall, the one that backed onto the main hallway, and behind a heavy antique bookshelf she found it. A small, circular brass plate no bigger than a quarter, painted over with a dozen layers of wall paint. It was the outlet for the speaking tube. She pressed her ear against it, and she could hear it, faintly but clearly, the sound of Arthur, the doorman, humming a quiet, off-key tune to himself at the front desk, 9 floors below. He hadn't been guessing. He hadn't been a brilliant detective. He had been listening. For years, possibly for decades, he had been the building's silent, secret, and all-knowing ear. His grandfatherly kindness, a perfect cover for a profound and deeply obsessive violation of the privacy of every single person in the building. She confronted him that afternoon. She walked into the quiet marble lobby. He was there at his desk sorting the mail. He looked up at her and gave her his usual warm smile. "Good afternoon, Ms. Day." She just looked at him, her face a cold, hard mask. She said, her voice a quiet, level sound. "The speaking tube, Arthur. The annunciator system, it still works, doesn't it?" The smile on his face did not vanish. It just changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by a look of quiet, sad, and deeply unsettling understanding. He said, his voice a soft, gentle sigh. "Ah, so you found the house's last little secret," she whispered, the question an accusation, a plea, a statement of profound, heartbreaking disbelief. "You've been listening to us, all of us, this whole time?" Chosen, he just looked at her, and his eyes were not the eyes of a monster, of a voyeur. They were the eyes of a profoundly lonely old man. He said, his voice a soft, nostalgic murmur. "This building, it's my family, the people in it. They are my children, my grandchildren. A family should have no secrets from each other. I wasn't spying, my dear. I was just keeping up. I was just being a part of the family." He leaned forward, a look of genuine and deeply terrifying concern on his face. "Especially with you, Jessica. After what that young man did to you before you came here. Knew I had to be extra vigilant. I had to watch over you to make sure you were truly safe, and there it was. The final, soul-crushing and utterly complete violation. He knew. He knew about her past, about her stalker, about the deepest, most private wound of her life. He had likely heard it in her own, tearful private phone calls to her therapist, and in his own twisted paternalistic mind, he had not seen his surveillance as a crime. He had seen it as an act of protection. He had become her new, more intimate, and infinitely more terrifying stalker. She was left with a choice that was no choice at all. She could go to the police, to the condo board, and expose him. She could destroy the life of a lonely, beloved, and deeply disturbed old man, and in doing so, become the villain of the building, the difficult new tenant who had betrayed their family's trust. Or she could stay silent and live in a beautiful gilded cage where the price of physical safety was the absolute and complete annihilation of her own private soul. She now lives in a state of quiet, constant, and inescapable awareness. She knows that the man at the front door is not a guardian. He is a warden, and she is haunted by the knowledge that the most terrifying monster is not the one who screams and threatens and breaks down your door. It's the one who does it with a kind, gentle smile, the one who does it for your own good, the one who does it with all his heart in the name of love. Selective enforcement of rules, a security camera that deliberately blinks, a campaign of anonymous threatening notes, and a doorman who is not a guardian, but a spy. These 4 stories peel back the pristine, sterile facade of modern condominium, living and expose the terrifying truth beneath. The greatest threat is not the stranger on the street, but the neighbor you share a wall with. The true horror of these accounts is the perversion of community. A condominium is supposed to be a shared sanctuary, a vertical neighborhood governed by rules designed to protect everyone. But these stories reveal how easily that system can be weaponized. The rule book becomes a sword, the security camera becomes a blindfold, and the friendly management becomes a silent accomplice. The monster here is not a ghost or a demon. It is a far more common and far more insidious creature. They say, tyranny of the clique, the power of a quiet collective conspiracy. These stories force us to confront a chilling and deeply uncomfortable reality. The quiet that you pay a premium for, the polite smiles in the elevator, the very silence of the building itself. It is not always a sign of peace. Sometimes, the true condo silence is the silence of complicity, the silence of people who are too afraid to speak up, the silence that allows the everyday threats to thrive just on the other side of your door. If these stories have made you listen a little more closely to the silence in your own building, prove you are not complicit by subscribing to Whispered Fear, leaving a like, and sharing this video. Your support helps us to amplify the voices that are being silenced. But what if the threat isn't a whisper from a neighbor, but a perfect replica of a loved one's voice calling you in a panic? Click the video on your screen now as we explore a new, terrifying frontier of technological deception. 4 True Scary. Stories of voice cloning scams that sound just like you. See you there, if you can trust the voice you're hearing.